Hello again, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Saturday's edition of Alaska Weather. And on the hazardous weather graphic today, not much, but there is a wind chill advisory out until 3 p.m. Sunday along the Alaska Highway east of Delta Junction, or actually from Delta Junction east. And that's for east winds gusting to 30 miles an hour, and that'll produce wind chills down to 45 degrees below zero. So again, a wind chill advisory out along the Alaska Highway, Delta Junction east until 3 p.m. Sunday. From there, satellite imagery showing some mid and high level clouds coming from northwest to southeast into the northwest and then toward the central interior. A little more solid band of moisture there over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, really thinning out over Bristol Bay with any precipitation amounts there pretty minimal. At best, minimal. In other words, nothing at all. Can see kind of an increase in the clouds there south of Yakutat over what we had yesterday. Also some clouds down across Kodiak Island, and especially to the east there, lower type clouds, and a little bit of that off the Kenai Peninsula, south of the Kenai Peninsula, but generally clearing out over the Panhandle with colder temperatures in the upper teens, lower 20s northern Panhandle, and staying well below freezing all the way down to Dixon Entrance, with winds gusting as high as 50 miles an hour, Lynn Canal area and the channeled areas of the northern Panhandle, a little bit less to the south. And then a band of moisture there right across the eastern Aleutians, kind of shifting over toward the Alaska Peninsula and weakening. That dropped a fair amount of rain over in Alaska in the last 24 hours. They picked up 1 2/3 inches of precipitation. And then back to the west there, Adak in the main low center, or around the main low circulation there, they picked up about 2/3 of an inch, or 3/4 of an inch of rain. And then Falls Pass, that front really weakening as it pushed eastward in the Alaska Peninsula. They only had about 2/10 of an inch and even lighter amounts over toward Cold Bay and Nelson Lagoon, but winds pretty gusty, as high as 72 miles an hour peak wind gust at Nikolsky as the front passed through there. And again, the Unalaska, Dutch Harbor area, 61 mile an hour peak wind gusts, about 45 miles per hour or so for St. George Island. And Cape Newenham on the southwest coast are at a peak wind gust just this afternoon of 60 miles an hour out of the east. And that all due to the gradient there between the low south of Atka and Adak, and then the strong surface high that's now shifted into the center of which is shifted into northwest Canada there, but still dominating all of interior Alaska. That colder air coming out over the Gulf, picking up some moisture, maybe a few slight snow showers there, and not much really for Kodiak Island, just clouds at this point, keeping it clear and cold, windy over the Panhandle, temperatures well below zero through the afternoon over the interior, all the way up to the Arctic coast, a little bit of patchy fog, but nothing too significant up in that area. For tonight, there won't be a lot of change out over the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, southern Bering Sea, under the influence of mild southeasterly flow ahead of that frontal boundary that sort of redevelops farther to the west now as the other one just completely washes out. Look for periods of rain and gusty winds, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, and all the way to Adak and Atka, as well as the Pribilos, but rainfall amounts will be pretty light in those areas. And stays quite windy over the northern Panhandle with gale force winds over Lynn Canal and northern inner channels with gusty northeast winds all the way down, even into the southern areas. They start to diminish. You see the gradient really slackens by the time you get to Dixon Entrance, but clear, cold conditions all the way, again, interior Alaska, maybe some variable clouds here and there around the interior, especially the eastern Arctic coast, North Slope areas. And then still that kind of ever slowly expanding area of snow showers for the Gulf, might reach the North Gulf Coast, may not. Could be some little bit of moisture shifting into Kodiak Island. Again, may not happen there as well. And for the forecast for Sunday, again, not much change. Clear, cold conditions in the interior with, again, those east winds along the eastern Alaska range there, east of Delta Junction, up to 30 miles an hour, producing those lower wind chills. So not too strong on the winds, and stays windy over northern Panhandle and less wind to the south, but clear and cold. Even colder temperatures tomorrow than today, a little bit there, as we'll see in the highs coming up, and some clouds along the eastern Arctic coast. And then some of that moisture that's been moving northwestward through the Russian Far East takes a turn to the northeast and then loses itself in the darkness of the Arctic and reappears. And that's a trough coming down. That'll spread some light snow and fog into the eastern Arctic coast coming southward, as well as the north slope, cutting off there at the Brooks Range, but that disturbance is going to drop due south. That's going to keep the very cold air locked in over much of, especially the central and eastern interior, into the middle of next week as that drops right on down in toward the western Copper River Basin. Otherwise, chance of snow showers, just a risk along the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island stays windy. Wind's a little less along over the northern Panhandle. Still looking at some gale force gusts there. Lincoln Glacier Bay front keeps it windy, wet, and mild for the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, western Alaska Peninsula, and the central and western Aleutians looking a little more showery. Kind of a break possibly there for Adak and Atka, especially wind-wise. May not see too much in the way of clearing, but be a little breezier with rain and snow showers for the western Aleutians. Low temperatures tonight down into the single numbers there for the northern Panhandle, right around 10 for Juneau. Otherwise, 10 to 15 most areas, a little milder out toward the Pacific. Lower mid-30s for the Copper River Basin, and below zero south central Alaska, but lower 30s for Kodiak, lower to mid-teens in Bristol Bay. Highs for tomorrow stays below zero Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley, 0 to 10 for south central Alaska, but lower 20s for the North Gulf Coast area. And highs, single numbers in the north to lower 20s in the south for the Panhandle, upper 30s Kodiak Island, 15 to 20 Bristol Bay, followed by lows 35 to 42 below in the Copper River Basin for Monday morning, and 15 to 25 below in the Kuskokwim Valley, 5 to 10 Bristol Bay, 30 Kodiak, and 5 to 20 below for south central Alaska, and below zero for the morning lows there for the northern Panhandle. Juneau forecast low of 4 below, 5 to 15 elsewhere, so pretty cold temperatures there. And then highs just barely getting above zero in the northern Panhandle, staying well below zero over the Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley. Highs, lows to the north there, lows tonight, 35 to 45 below eastern interior, a little above zero for the Seward Peninsula, followed by highs tomorrow, 25 to 35 below central eastern interior, and above zero out to the west and even the western Arctic coast, mid-20s for the St. Lawrence Island area. Lows 40 to 50 below eastern interior Monday morning. Highs well below zero again, except mid-20s for St. Lawrence Island, and 10 to 15 for the southwest coast. Lows tonight, but staying in the mild lower 40s, eastern Aleutians, eastern central Aleutians. Highs tomorrow, 40 to 45.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
First line weather graphic here showing a lot of IFR in place over the Bering Sea, St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, St. George, most of the Aleutians, and the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. Some IFR over the Yukon Flats there down toward the mid-Yukon River Valley. Otherwise, VFR from the Arctic coast all the way down to Bristol Bay, northern Bering Sea, and Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula. Some marginal VFR there on the eastern North Gulf Coast. And around Kodiak Island, Panhandle, VFR. For the afternoon, not much change out west, about the same. IFR in place, about the same location as the morning. And maybe marginal VFR covering all of Kodiak Island now, up right along the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula. Not quite into southern Prince William Sound, but extending up toward Cordova. Cape St. Elias stays VFR over the Panhandle. All of interior Alaska, VFR from the Arctic coast to Togiak and Bristol Bay, as well as Cook Inlet. Then on Monday, some IFR drops down from the Arctic there onto the eastern Arctic coast, North Slope area, but gets cut off at the Brooks Range. So south of the mountains there stays VFR all the way down till the North Gulf Coast. Start picking up some areas of marginal VFR, but it's a little more widespread around Kodiak Island. Stays VFR in the Panhandle, and the IFR still in place out over the Bering Sea. For Monday afternoon, IFR kind of retreating westward a little bit, or falling back, actually becoming VFR for Shimianet 2. And IFR now from Adak eastward to the Fox Islands, marginal for the Pribilofs, and the western Alaska Peninsula becoming VFR, expanding westwards. You can see a little bit farther to the west there for the afternoon with easterly flow along the southwest coast up through the Bering Strait. IFR now eastern Arctic coast. And again, some scattered areas of marginal VFR, roughly from about Pasagchak, Kodiak Island there, Fognak Island, and mostly off the coast, except for possibly Cape St. Elias. Stays VFR for the Panhandle. Passes Anatuvik and Adigan, both VFR tomorrow. Another VFR day or two coming up for Lake Clark and Merrill, as well as rainy, windy VFR, either approach and Isabel. Good VFR tomorrow. Mintesta, VFR as well. Tanita, another VFR day coming up, and Sunday looking good for Portage, both east and west entrance. Chilkoot and White, VFR. Freezing levels, warm air aloft with the southerly flow and along with the upper level ridging. So 6,000 feet there over the northern Bering Sea and 2,000 feet north of St. Lawrence Island, but still south of the Bering Strait. And that warm air kind of in over the southwest interior, but 2,000 feet down across Sitkinak Island. And for icing, areas of isolated moderate rime icing, several bands out there to the west in the Bering Sea, kind of locked in place, held back from making a much eastward progress with a high over the interior southeasterly flow, and that keeps it in over the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, another couple of bands over the western Aleutians and far western Bering Sea areas. Icing free, remainder of the state and the Panhandle looking good. Jet stream, north winds, 105 knots there, right out of the north, and then diminished to about 85 knots across the Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet, and down toward Resurrection Bay. Then they turn northwest, 95 knots, but south of the Panhandle, a couple upper level lows, and at 9,000 feet, the one off the Arctic coast there, that's going to be dropping due south over the next couple of days, right on down into the Copper River Basin. And that's going to keep cold northerly flow in over the western central interior and lighter winds to the east. 3,000 feet, southeast winds, 35 to 50 knots there over the Bering Sea, especially over the northwest Bering Sea. That's where the winds will be the strongest, and about 30 to 40 knots there for the central Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula. East winds, 35 knots there coming out of the central interior, becoming more widespread as it heads across the Yukon Delta, turning southeast toward the Bering Strait. High pressure making for light winds over the Yukon, northern interior, southern interior looking light, as well as the Panhandle looking at pretty light winds, 3,000 feet. Some channeled outflow winds there, but nothing too serious. Turbulence, look for considerable moderate turbulence there for the northern Panhandle, light to isolated moderate across the south central interior, as well as the Alaska Peninsula westward to Kiska Island.
Dual polarization technology is a major upgrade to the current radar system. It allows forecasters a better idea of what's actually out there and can help keep you safe.
Current radar technology transmits and receives information in the horizontal direction, which is very limited. Dual polarization technology, in addition to the horizontal, transmits and receives vertical energy, which allows forecasters to get information about the size, shape, and phase of the precipitation. We can use that information to better determine the precipitation type to expect at your given location.
There you have it. This new technology is currently being installed in radars across the country and is already being used by National Weather Service forecasters to produce better, more accurate forecasts. Learn more here and follow us. Want to know about the future of weather radar? Well, the National Severe Storms Lab has it here with its new phased array radar. Let's check it out.
It's a non-moving radar. It has 4 faces of the antenna, each pointing in different directions. One of the big advantages is that we're seeing so far, it can sample the area around the radar in less than a minute, maybe even a half a minute. And this is 5-6 times faster than what they can do today.
NSSL is leading the development of future weather radar with this project. Learn more here and follow us. The Storm Prediction Center is one of the NOAA weather partners. They are located in the National Weather Center in Norman, Oklahoma. Greg Carbon gives us a glimpse into what the SPC does.
Our mission is to analyze and forecast severe thunderstorms and the potential for tornadoes, large hail, and damaging winds from those thunderstorms across the lower 48 states, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. One of the primary missions of the Storm Prediction Center is the issuance of severe thunderstorm and tornado watches across the country when conditions appear to be coming together to support the development of severe thunderstorms and tornadoes.
The world-class meteorologists in the Storm Prediction Center specialize in severe weather and keeping you safe. Learn more here and follow us.
The National Severe Storms Lab is working on increasing the lead time for severe weather warnings. The national average for tornado warnings is currently 13 minutes, but more notice would be helpful, especially for those in charge of moving large groups to shelter. Warn on Forecast will help forecasters issue hazardous weather warnings earlier. The project will give them more info about the chances of strong winds, large hail, and even tornadoes.
Currently, warnings are created by forecasters looking at the atmosphere outside, understanding its volatility, and then comparing that to how they see the Doppler radar presenting what's going on inside the thunderstorms. Warn on Forecast is an idea where we're going to take the massive amounts of satellite, radar, and surface data and stick them all into a very high-resolution prediction model. And then by producing new forecasts every 15 or 20 minutes, the forecasters hopefully will be able to use that model to produce warnings that extend out to an hour.
Before the National Weather Service can use this tool, it must be developed and tested. One big challenge will be deciding how to get the model predictions to the forecasters.
I'm going to keep this one very low. I'm just adjusting the track.
These hazardous weather prediction models are going to produce a huge amount of output. And this fire hose of data is just too much for forecasters to handle in real time quickly. So in order to help deal with that, NSSL has developed a related project called Facets. And Facets is the methodology which will enable forecasters to focus very quickly on the most important threats.
Once Warn on Forecast and Facets are proven to be reliable and effective, then forecasters will be better able to inform you of threats nearby. Learn more here and follow us.
The Hazardous Weather Test Bed is located at the National Weather Center in Norman, Oklahoma. It is used for experiments that will allow forecasters to learn and apply new technologies.
The Hazardous Weather Test Bed is a really unique space throughout all of NOAA, and this is where the researchers and the operational folks come together in a common space to solve operational problems and to test new research tools that the research community is working on. The goal is to accelerate the transfer from research to operations of the newest tools and techniques.
People come from around the world to collaborate on this unique project.
And we can bring together not only NOAA people, but also university people, faculty, researchers, private sector meteorologists, folks working in other countries in meteorology, forecasters can all come together and focus on what the problem of the day is with the forecasters.
Each spring, several experiments occur in the hazardous weather test bed. Learn more here and follow us.
What are you looking at? And what are you ignoring? Did you notice the NOAA logo in the corner? Forecasters have a lot of information in front of them too. Every second counts during severe weather, and decisions about where to focus are constantly being made. This could be even more challenging in the future. Phased array radar will produce 4 to 6 times more information than what we have now, which brings us to the question researchers are hoping to answer. Will more radar information affect forecasters' decisions?
From our past experiments, we've learned a lot about how forecasters think during the warning decision process, but we've also learned that those thought processes are very complex, and for that reason, we need a better way to be able to track forecasters' cognitive activity.
Inbounds and possibly golf ball size hail.
An eye tracker is a piece of technology that is used to determine in real time where someone's eye gaze is located. And these eye trackers are typically video-based, which means a camera sits below a computer monitor, and with infrared light and vector analysis, we can determine where a person is looking and how their eyes are moving.
Eye tracking is already being used in the medical field and air traffic control. Using similar research methods, NSSL is discovering the benefit for weather forecasting too. Phased array radar will give forecasters a lot more to think about. Understanding their decision-making process will help researchers develop even more user-friendly tools. So what's the benefit for you? Even better weather warnings. To learn more, check us out online and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to today's sea ice analysis, you can see the area from the Bering Strait northward just about closed off now and covered. And moving on to the coastal water forecasts. Small craft advisories for the south coast of the Panhandle, northeast winds 25 knots, and some gale warnings along the north coast for east winds 30 to 35 knots for Sunday. Northern interchannels, gale warnings, north winds 40 knots, Stevens Passage, north winds 35 knots, and lighter northeast winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Monday, still small craft advisories on the south coast, east-southeast winds 25 knots, and still some gales along the north coast, east winds 30 to 40 knots with seas up around 15 feet. Gale warnings for the northern inside waters there, northwest 35 knots, northeast 30 knots for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, southern interchannels, north at about 20 knots, seas as high as 6 feet. Cook Inlet, northeast winds on Sunday, 15 to 25 knots. Northeast 25-knot winds in the forecast for Kamishak Bay. And the Barren Islands, looking at east winds Sunday at 20 knots. And the western North Gulf Coast, northeast at 20 knots. Prince William Sound, northeast winds just 15 knots and seas down to 3 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 25, gusts 35 knots. And for Monday, North Gulf Coast, east-southeast winds 20 knots, seas 7 to 8 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast at 15. Northern Cook Inlet looking at a northeast wind at 10 knots, but small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet, north at 25. And Kamishak Bay, north winds 20 knots. And Monday, Barren Islands will see west winds at 25 knots. Kodiak Island, Sunday, east-northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Alaska Peninsula, east winds 25 to 30 knots, and northeast at about 25 for Bristol Bay. And for Monday, Alaska Peninsula easterlies 30 to 35 knots, northeast around 20 there for 25 for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, east side of the island there, south at 20 knots with 8-foot seas. Shelikof Strait, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots, seas 7 feet. Eastern and central Aleutians tomorrow, west-east winds 25 to 30 knots with seas running 11 to 16 feet. And for the western Aleutians, northwest winds at 30 knots with 14-foot seas. And for Monday, from Kiska to Shemya, southeast winds 30 knots, seas up to 26 feet. And for the Amchitka Island area, lighter winds there, southeast at about 20 knots. And gale warnings for the central Aleutians, southeast winds as high as 35 knots. Gale warnings for the Fox Islands, east and northeast winds 40 to 45 knots with 14 to 20-foot seas. For the southwest coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots for the day Sunday. East winds at 30 knots for the Pribilofs, east at 30 for St. Matthew Island, and east winds at 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Norton Sound, brisk wind advisories for northeast winds at 25 knots. And for Monday, east winds 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island, the southwest coast. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, and St. George Islands. East winds 40 knots with 15 to 20-foot seas. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast Sunday, southwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Central coast looking at west winds at about 15 knots. And then for the western Arctic coast, winds become east 10 to 15 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the area from Wales to Cape Thompson. And Monday, Wales to Cape Thompson, east winds at 20 knots. And for the western Arctic coast, southeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Central coast looking pretty light, north at 10, and west winds at 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline. For tonight, clear cold temperatures well below zero, anywhere from 30 to 50 below in the interior, especially over the eastern interior areas. And stays windy and turning still colder temperatures in store for the northern panhandle, cold and breezy conditions all the way down to Dixon Entrance. Snow showers developing over the Gulf of Alaska that may or may not graze the North Gulf Coast. A little bit better chance for Kodiak Island, but whatever does fall will be light. Rain and wind continues to the Alaska Peninsula, central eastern Aleutians, and the Pribilofs through tomorrow as well. And maybe some shower activity reaching Kodiak Island, but staying mostly off the North Gulf Coast. Clear, cold, and windy for the Panhandle and southeast interior. Dry and cold for the remainder of interior Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.